Hi. If the Democratic Party supporting slavery in the 19th century means the Democratic Party today is racist, so does that mean that Karl Marx and Engels writing for the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley's Republican newspaper in the 1860s, does that mean the Republican Party is the party of socialism today?
We have here an exercise in reasoning that needs to be put into slow motion to be dissected. Okay, so the reasoning is the following. First, you're contending that I contend that because the Democratic Party was the party of slavery before the Civil War, therefore the Democratic Party is racist today. I would submit that I have made no such argument here tonight. For anyone listening fairly, my argument was that the party of slavery prior to the Civil War metamorphosed into the party of racism after the Civil War. And this racism carried well into the 20th century. In fact, when we talk about things like the Klan, it's always amusing to me. People go, well, what about David Duke? This is the precise type of counterexample intended to mislead. Because if you fairly were to say, let me really look at the topic. Let me make a list of all the Ku Klux Klan leaders, every Grand Dragon and Grand Kleagle, going back to the 1870s to now. And let's just put an R or a D after their name, 99% of them would be Democrats. That's a fact. The idea of David Duke is a false flag intended to camouflage attention and prevent a legitimate generalization from being made. Now, so the Democratic Party isn't the party of racism because of what happened before slavery. The Democratic Party self-consciously embraced racism after slavery. Lyndon Johnson, this is a very good example because Lyndon Johnson is supposed to be a metaphor for the whole Democratic Party. Yeah, he was kind of a racist in his old Texas country boy days, the narrative goes, but then he became a marvelous, morally enlightened person and championed the Civil Rights Act. I would submit that if you read anything about Lyndon Johnson, you will see that this is a flat-out lie. The fact of the matter is that Lyndon Johnson was routinely using the N-word after the Civil Rights Act. And there is the multiple examples of this from Robert Caro, from Doris Kearns Goodwin, from Lyndon Johnson's own driver. This is corroborated, it's attested, it's indisputable, and yet it is pushed under the rug by progressive historians who need the fake narrative. The fake narrative is the narrative of conversion. There was no conversion. Lyndon Johnson, once a bigot, always a bigot. So now a more interesting question emerges. Why would a bigot promote the Civil Rights Act of 1964? And I would submit that the reason for that is that the bigot realized I can't cash in on white racism anymore. I've got to create a new type of dependent class of people who are now going to have to vote for me, and they're the very people I've been kicking around. Just listen to Lyndon Johnson's famous Howard University speech, a beautiful example of outright deception. Here's Johnson. He goes, "You can't take a man who has been hobbled for decades and bring him up to the starting line and tell him to run on his own." And now I ask you, what is omitted from this moving sentence? What is omitted from this moving sentence? Who the hell has been hobbling this guy for decades, if not you? If not you. So if you, Lyndon Johnson, take 1 ounce of moral responsibility and say, I did it, and now I am willing to pay a price to set it right, but the deceitful bigot could not admit that. Even then, he was playing the same game that is played to now, which is let's blame it on somebody else. You cannot take a man who has been hobbled. Let's move into the convenient passive voice, as if somebody else did it. I'm here to fix it. I'm Lyndon Johnson. So history involves reading a little between the lines, recognizing that just as we have fake news, we have fake history, we have fake scholarship, you're smart enough here to know this and to be able to do this kind of reading, and it's very liberating. When you do it, it's very liberating. Okay, next question.
I think your response to that last question is is definitely helpful in recognizing that some facts may be misleading, such as if I were to come up and give a lecture on Karl Marx and the history of communism in the Republican Party. Obviously, we can cherry pick facts. And so I want to bring up this concern I have with some of your crushing facts, right? In that when you state just one small fact without contextualizing it, you run the risk of being counter to the generalization, which obviously my friend's fact was, right?
Agree completely.
And so I have a couple of facts that I think can help round out the picture. So one here, in response to the Southern strategy question. This is a quote from Kevin Phillips, Nixon's political strategist.
Yes.
It says, "The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That is where the votes are. Without prodding from blacks, the whites will backside into their old, comfortable arrangement with local Democrats." Right? So he's making the argument that we need the votes from the negrophobe whites, not from the urban whites, as you suggested. And that's coming from Nixon's campaign manager. Secondly, data on support for the Civil Rights Act. In the South, 7% of Democrats in Congress supported the Civil Rights Act, and 0% of Republicans did. And in the North, 96% of Democrats and 84% of Republicans supported the Civil Rights Act. That fact, to me, seems like this was not a party issue, but a geography issue, in that very few people in the South supported the Civil Rights Act, and the vast majority of Northerners in both parties did. So then, the fact that right now the South is strongly Republican, and prior to the Civil Rights Act, the South was prominently Democrat, suggests to me that the party representation has switched to match that geographical preference.
Excellent question. And I will try to do justice because you've raised a lot of points. Let's start with Kevin Phillips. You need to pick up Kevin Phillips' book, The Emerging Republican Majority. You described Kevin Phillips as Nixon's campaign manager, which he was not. Second of all, Kevin Phillips says very clearly on the first page, you are going to get from me an analysis of voting patterns in America. It is not a description of anything that Nixon did. In fact, Kevin Phillips says, Nixon has not seen any of my work. I'm writing it after the election. So Phillips makes it really clear that he is not the architect of anything. He is rather interpreting in his own way. And you have to remember, Kevin Phillips is a guy who swung from one side to the other of the political pendulum. So you've got a character who's mercurial in his judgments and has said the opposite things at different times. Nevertheless, let's move on to the larger point, which is, according to you, this party division is a geographical and not a partisan divide. And the technique you're using to demonstrate this is, you could call it controlling for region. Controlling for region, you're saying, the discrepancy between the parties at least diminishes, even if it doesn't go away altogether. The problem with the controlling for region is that you cannot control for something when the party itself is pushing to achieve that regional phenomenon. Let me tell you what I mean. We think today of the South as being the racist side of the country. C. Van Woodward tells us, the Yale historian, that after the Civil War, in the early 20th century and in the late 19th century, when the segregation debate, he goes, there was massive opposition to segregation in the South. He goes, this emergence of a Southern racist party, he says, was not foreordained. It was not the automatic result of the war. He goes, don't confuse slavery with racism. They're related, but they're not the same thing. Hold on, let me finish. The point I want to make is this. The Democratic Party cultivated the bigotry in the South that became a Southern phenomenon. So you can't now say, well, let's control for Southernness and take it all out and excuse all the Democrats because they're just being good old Southerners. I'm saying no. I'm saying that the Democrats polluted the South with a racist ideology and drove the Republicans out of the South. This was the whole point of the Ku Klux Klan. Racial terrorism was aimed at crushing the black Republican Party in the South. So you can't control for these things. The Democratic Party had its base in the South, and it was a racist base. The Republican Party has its base in the North, and it was a non-racist base. So now we turn to your last point, which is the most tempting of all. Gee, Dinesh, the Republicans used to be, the South used to be Republican. I'm sorry, the South used to be Democratic through most of the 20th century. It's now Republican. Big switch. No. The key question here, I agree, there are actually, I would add to your switch, blacks who used to be Republicans are now Democrats. Big switch. The key question when you see these switches is to ask this question: when did the switch occur? So for blacks, let me tell you, the switch occurred in the 1930s. In 1932, 75% of blacks voted for Herbert Hoover. In 1936, 75% of blacks voted for FDR. Blacks switched into the Democratic Party, having nothing to do with the civil rights movement and nothing to do with racism, because the Democratic Party at that time was openly the party of segregation and the Ku Klux Klan. It was the economic benefits of the New Deal. That's a fact. The other fact is that the South moved into the Republican Party under Reagan and in the 90s under Gingrich. So what was the Reagan agenda? Now, this I know from being up close. The Reagan agenda was patriotism, anti-communism, free markets, family values, pro-life, Christianity. Now, a very appealing agenda to a lot of Southerners. This was a continuation of the strategy of appealing to the non-racist South. So here's the beauty of it. If you want to be empirical, step back and draw two lines. The line of Southern racism, which you'll notice in the 20th century, is going like this, down ever since World War II. And the line of Southern republicanism, which is going like this, in the other direction. So as the South becomes less and less racist, it becomes more and more Republican.